I'm Damien Wetzel. I'm the director of Aspen Institute's Arts Programs, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this special evening with Teresita Fernández. I want to thank our dear friend Aggie Gund for being our hostess for this evening. Aggie is a shero of so many good things, and among her good works was that she introduced me to Teresita, and I'm ever grateful for all that's come out of that. I want to welcome members of the Aspen Institute Arts Circle who are here with us. We value your support so greatly for our work, bringing art forward as a method for social change, whether in education, in diplomacy, or in economics, or in every area of society. We believe that culture and the arts actually have the impact that matters. It is our shared humanity that we are talking about, and it goes right from the aspirational to the nuts and bolts. Tonight, we have the privilege to be talking with Teresita, whose work embodies so many elements of the idea of what art can say to us, what it can make us say, what it challenges us to think, and it addresses everything in history right down to the present moment and into the future. So thank you for joining us. I want to thank the gallery. I want to thank David for hosting us here, and let's begin. So Teresita, I thought we'd start simply by talking about the art itself. You and I spoke about that's the way in, and I always think about for myself having the privilege to be with an artist with their work, which really is how we designed this. When we thought we'd do something together, we thought, well, let's do it surrounded by the art. And at that point, I didn't actually realize we literally would be surrounded by the art. So tell us about this work in particular and all that's surrounding us, and tell us about the art. The making of it.
Well, thank you, first of all, to you for coming up with this idea, and to Aggie for hosting us tonight, and to all of you for being here. And yeah, I always like to start with the art because, of course, you know, in general, to kind of understand how my mind works and how I make things, it's important to understand that I really do not have a hierarchy, that my experience of the world and of place is very holistic. And so I understand places in formal ways, in aesthetic ways, in historic ways, but also as a citizen and also as a human being and also as somebody with a certain set of experiences. And so when I talk about this work, I think it's always important to not, as the audience I'm saying, to not get too hooked to any one narrative, but to kind of try to understand that the way the world really works, and the way that my world really works certainly, is that there are all of these stacked, I call them stacked landscapes, which is a metaphor for talking about this sense that we're always in more than one place at once. And that our lens and our sort of perception of what we're reading is contradictory, and that it's subtle, and that it's complex. And so I don't always have a quick packaged narrative about what the work is, although you might read a press release and think that it is about one thing. But pretty much I started this body of work about 9 months ago, before the election. And I was thinking a lot about American violence, and I was thinking a lot about even the term America and how it is that we use that word in a very sloppy way. So as an artist, I was also thinking about images and how the things that drive me as an artist aren't separate from my reactions to what's happening in the world. So I started to do a bunch of research, and I was thinking about a lot of different things. So I was thinking of things like Chinese scrolls, which are very beautiful because in them you're always kind of traveling, and you unfurl the scroll sort of shoulders width apart, you know, wide, and you unfurl it, and then you furl it again, scroll it again, and go to the next one. So you're kind of moving through these scenes, and your scale is changing. Your human scale, as that figure in the landscape, is constantly shifting. So you're becoming small, and then you're pulling out. It's a very almost cinematic kind of experience. I was also thinking a lot about Standing Rock. I was thinking about trees. I was thinking about very particular trees. I was thinking about southern trees. I am always thinking of how I can amplify the idea of landscape, right? So the word landscape it's kind of a foil for me, right? Because people assume that landscapes are passive, and so they're not offended by them in any way. And it isn't that I'm not interested in particular places and in their vast history and sort of like their contradictory history. I am. It's just that my sense of what a landscape is not necessarily tied to art history or an iconographic sense of what we've been taught. And so it's less Poussin or Cole or church and more lynching trees and mass graves on the border, which are also landscapes, right? But the way that the word landscape has been codified for us is that it means a fixed view or a fixed vista in front of our eyes. So one of the first things that I tried to do in here was to make an environment that was completely immersive, where everywhere you turned, you had to find, you had to place yourself, right? And so I used the word place as both a noun and as a verb. We are all constantly placing ourselves within places, right? We walk through one door and we have one set of privileges. We walk through another door and we may lose them all, right? And so we're constantly negotiating this idea of wayfinding, which is another way of looking at landscape. The fire piece in the back was also placed that way very much in again, as a very cinematic reference, as a way of trying to understand the space as something that we were witnessing and that we were watching kind of burn before our very eyes.
So there's a lot of things I want to talk about in there. I want to go back to your initial thoughts of landscape when you first were thinking about being an artist, as far back as you can remember. But let's talk just a little bit about the main piece here and its nature. So it's ceramic. Can you tell us a little bit about working with ceramic, the beginnings of that, how you came to that for this particular project?
So I'm not, my work is really conceptual, so I'm not tied to particular materials. I'll work with anything if it makes sense for the idea. And the idea is what drives how I choose the material that I'm going to work with or what I'm going to do with it. So in this show, there are very rigorous thematic choices that are occurring, which is that all of the images in the exhibition are made from materially the very thing that they're referring to. And so the panel in the back, the panel, it's called Fire America, is made out of ceramic, glazed ceramic, so it's literally, clay from the earth that's been glazed with minerals, right? Glazes are minerals, and fired at a very high temperature. So the material and the image are sympathetic. They are the same thing. The image is being made by the actual process that it's describing. And it's the same thing with the drawing, which is made out of charcoal. Right, so it's made out of drawn charcoal, but the pieces are actually constructed from solid charcoal, which is basically just wood. It's trees that have been burned in an environment where there's very little oxygen, and so they don't just burn away and turn into ashes, but they harden this way. And so they are depicting a landscape, but they actually are physically part of a landscape, of a real place. The drawings in the front also kind of fall into that category, the paper being also from trees, and the image being made by burning, so by destroying or by eroding or by defacing that pulp material.
So interestingly, so you made these limitations on yourself, but it sounds like it came very organically. Like this was the story you were telling out of the same materials that were the story. It sounds like what it is.
Yeah, it's oddly enough, the process is not that self-conscious. It's just that when something isn't right, you end up throwing it out. So if you throw out enough things, what's left over is the thing that seems to make sense. But it is a very organic process. It isn't like I come up with a set of rules and then have to find things that meet it. And a lot of it has to do, right, with how it looks, because you know, I always say that my prime tools as an artist for anything, as a catalyst for anything, for change, for changing people's perception, is beauty and being able to manipulate people's imagination. And I say the word manipulate in a very loving way here, in a generous way, right? Because we're all constantly being manipulated by all kinds of stimuli, and so. I think that beauty is one of my goals as well. If I can make beautiful images, which is very hard to do, by the way. This is not an easy thing to do. It is, you know, it's a very difficult thing to do. The world and natural images are way more beautiful than anything that we can make. And so it is a challenge in and of itself. But there's a kind of sidestepping that beauty allows that seduces the viewer to want to think about other things that may be tied to the concept.
Did you throw a lot of things out?
Yeah.
So I was lucky enough to visit you at the studio when a lot of the charcoal work was being done. And then I saw a video online, time sped up video of this being put in. I encourage you to do that. I don't know how they can find it, but you had it online, just of the time-lapse video of this coming together. And it was fascinating to watch a landscape, essentially, happen. So let's go back to that for a minute. What is the landscape in your mind specific to this? So we are dealing with fire, and by nature of the title, we're dealing with America, and we're dealing with the remains all around us of fire. When you thought to do this, and you were talking about the time frame specifically about this, over the last 9 months, and the violence things and other things that were spurring you, can you give us some insight, or do you want to give us some insight, or do you prefer that people just find what they want to find in it?
No, I mean, I'm happy to give insight about my own sort of creative process. So one of the things that, you know, it's interesting because as a person of color, you go through art school and through all of your art experiences, and you may never see anything that looks anything remotely like your history. And so you always learn the canon of the dominant culture before your own. And so one of my sort of lifelong, I mean, not now I'm old, but like when I was like out of school and piecing together, one of my challenges was really trying to piece together my actual history and how I can kind of understand my artistic ancestors, let's say my elders, right, or where ideas come from, while simultaneously being a product of a quote-unquote American art education, right, which is a very sort of narrow, controlled view of what even American is. So for most Latinos, for example, from anybody from Latin America, you know, the word America is only used in the singular in this country. For the rest of us, it's the Americas, right? Any Spanish speaker or a Canadian would talk about the Americas, and it's always plural. And so the lens of trying to figure out how my work fit into the canon I learned and inherited as a quote-unquote American, and all of the kind of erasure and lack of information that I had to understand what that meant with my own experience. So, wait, I was going to answer the original question. I'm kind of meandering.
That's okay. There's a lot there, too.
Yeah, so originally, so there's always a joke that I tell myself, right? And so when I started this body of work, I was thinking of like, well, what's American art? You know, and there's always like the inside joke to me is there's a piece that you learn in art school called Various Small Fires and a Glass of Milk by Rouchet. It's a series of photographs. And then a couple of years later, Bruce Nauman does a performance where he takes the book and burns it, right? And so I was playing around with these ideas and references in contemporary art history, recent art history, of the use of fire, but the references were always things that never had anything to do with me, but I somehow knew them, right? And so by taking those same images and sort of usurping them, but also expanding them, there's a way of negotiating that you come from something, but it's not really, it's not really reflective of your experience, right? And so I know that this is not a simple answer, but it's partially because it's not a simple question. It's a very complex question that has to do with that same kind of wayfinding that you as viewers have to do negotiating any space is the same kind of wayfinding that I have to do to create the art in the first place.
I mean, you're talking about addressing narratives that are not relevant to the audience. In this case, it's your own narrative as you addressed becoming an artist and the education process. And I often thought in the time I've known you that, you're an educator, actually. Through your art, you're trying to address things and tell in Socratic method in some way, like asking a question for us to answer. But I'm curious that, in that space, we're in public, it's a piece of art, and we're in public, and then there's quote-unquote public art, like the Fata Morgana project, which you're incredibly well known for. And how do you deal with audience in that case? Do you think differently, or does it exist just based on the space that it's going to, simply? Is it about, you knew you were going to do this here, for instance. You knew you were going to do Fata Morgana in Madison Square Park. How specific is it for you? Is it all about the place? But because I think there's an ongoing dialogue about education and questioning.
It's funny that you perceive it that way, because I actually think of myself more as a student than an educator, or perhaps it's that in order to educate, you have to be willing to learn. And I'm interested in difficult things, and difficult things are not, are things that you have to be willing to place yourself in a position of a learner, a student, in order to understand. So my position as an artist is always that I'm curious and I'm rigorous, but I'm most interested in challenging myself first. If I can't get there, I actually have no knowledge to impart or to share. So the work is often very site-specific in the sense that I'm trying to understand and unravel the wealth of information that place has. And so places are often very haunted. They often have a kind of tone and a kind of history that's heavy but not always visible, right? So I like to sometimes think of the landscape being not just about what you see, but about everything that you don't see. And the site specificity will often happen from a research point of view, right? So the first thing I do is I ask myself, where am I? And I take that question very seriously. I ask myself, wherever I am, whether it's here, whether it's in Madison Square Park, I ask myself, where am I? Where are my coordinates? Where am I historically, socially, economically, racially? Like, what has happened here? All the things that you can kind of Google and find out about something. And then getting to the harder things of, how does this place exist in people's imagination? Because that's really actually where the power of art and really of anything lies, is like, how is it that somebody's perceptions are formed around this thing? And that's different than facts, right? It's actually much more powerful than facts.
It is. You're talking about a recognition in a funny way of what exists, but perhaps we're not acknowledging in some cases, or it needs to be brought to attention, but you are, let's turn back again. So this is Fire America, and it is, in my mind, to my mind, I'm available to understand that there's a fire burning in America and it's specific to this time, and there are issues that are roiling, and then I take it to what's around me, the detritus around me of chard, and I feel like it's a warning. There's a soothsayer quality. There's something that's telling me that this is a warning, and this is Teresita warning us. Now, that's me. And I wonder if, first of all, does that ring in any way, or is that what you were hoping for? Or, you know?
It's funny because there's a review that came out today that Seth Rodney wrote, wonderful writer, and he's talking about, he's saying a lot of these same things, and he's kind of saying, there's one line where he says, by the time you recognize the landscape, it's too late, you know? And I feel like it's such a good line to describe the moment that we are in right now, which a lot of people continue to describe as a kind of being blindsided, right? And yeah, so I don't know if it's a warning, right? So I was already thinking about these things. I think that it wasn't that great before, right? So my first reaction is that, yeah, it's convenient to sort of think of it as a warning. But by the time you've figured that out, it is too late, right? Like by the time somebody's making art about that, it's too late. And so I kind of am interested in anticipating things before there are warnings, and I don't always know how to do that. I think that there's a kind of, for lack of a better word, trend right now of lots of different organizations inviting artists to somehow make sense of things. And while I think that that's a very potentially powerful solution, I also think that it's incredibly naive, because the truth is that artists have always been doing that, and that when they're actually doing it, nobody recognizes it, right? People only recognize it in hindsight when they can tell a story about it or place it. And I say that because I think it's very important to support artistic vision even when it doesn't make sense to anybody else yet, right? And it's a very vulnerable process, actually, where you have to actually be experiencing those things and working through them in order to get to that thing that might be that precursor to something, or that warning, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, well said, all of it, especially the idea that, you know, that Seth wrote about today, about it might be, by the time you realize it might be too late. And I feel like that's around us. I feel like we're looking at that, in a sense. We get to see it, a different type of time lapse in the work. And you referenced that it wasn't so great before. And, you know, you certainly, you are an outspoken champion for the need for much more representation of people of color in leadership positions in the art world and across the board, as we discussed when we talk, you and I. And I'm curious that this is just for myself in a way, but we're all here. What age did that first occur to you? That not just about the art world, but just in general.
I think when I needed it, and when I needed it as a way of surviving. I think that there's a great luxury to coming to things because somebody presents them or because you're ready for them. And the way that most people get to things that are important is simply out of need. Like, they need to address that thing in order to be true to the work that they're doing. So, I mean, I haven't always been championing certain ideas because I was too busy just trying to be that thing. And I think that at some point in my career, I realized that I actually had my own power, and that I had the power to point out that, you know, I was successful enough to point out that there wasn't a single Latino in any collection that I ever saw, that you could go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art or to the Whitney or to any biennial and pretty much not see anybody, like not be able to tell the story of the history of this country and what it means to be an American. And I think, especially for Latinos, which is just the part that I relate to personally, and by the way, for anybody who might be new to that conversation, Latinidad is an ethnicity. There are Afro-Latinos, there are Asian Latinos, there are Jewish Latinos, there are white Latinos. And I think that at some point I realized that I could actually be that thing and point to that thing, which is hard to do, right? Because it's hard enough to just be an artist. But that I had a responsibility also to point to certain things. So one of actually the main thing that I did was Darren Walker at the Ford gave me a grant to organize a symposium at the Ford Foundation, which was, I think, a kind of unprecedented gathering of Latino leaders and non-Latino leaders, directors of museums and curators and artists who could speak for themselves in a public setting, to really sort of talk about the invisibility. And I think that it's really important when we talk about invisibility, like when you say, you know, you go, you see this, but what about what you don't see, is that things are not just invisible. There's a very, and we will not get anywhere, right, in art or in social justice or equity until we actually realize that it isn't just that things are invisible, it's that there is a very, very active campaign to deliberately make things invisible, right? That's my starting point. And so how one can represent within that and also still be true to one's personal narrative, one's artistic concerns, which may or may not, you know, dovetail with bigger issues about being a Latino or being this or one's identity.
I was about to ask that. How neatly do they dovetail? Because it doesn't seem like you're doing any projects in some way that, I mean, the one, you answer, I won't put the words in your mouth.
Yeah, I mean, they do and they don't, because I'm interested in universal themes, right? So I've actually spent much more time in Japan than in Cuba, where my parents are from. You know, I feel like I have a really deep understanding of Japanese culture and aesthetic, but somehow that doesn't fit into the Latino narrative. And for a while I was kind of, it bothered me that I had to choose until I realized that the real power is in that liminal space, right? The real power is in the liminal spaces. It's in being able to move through one space and another, and to not have to see the art world or any other world really in that binary way of like in, out, you know, privileged, disenfranchised, you know, minority, that, you know, it's like, well, we're all those things sort of in different situations all the time. And that the strength of my personal work, like my work and how I could bring the complexity of that, bringing the complexity of that narrative, even of the narrative of identity itself, which is a vastly like complicated thing to take apart, was the strength of it, was to not be apologetic about how messy and contradictory and subtle the whole thing actually was, whether it's in personal identity or in how the work is then read by, in an art context, right? So, yeah, the work that I'm drawn to and the work that I'm trying to create is one that that kind of rises above, hopefully, the ability to be pigeonholed one way or another, right? I'm interested in sort of bigger ideas.
I wanted to open up for questions, so I'll give you a warning. We have a microphone that'll be passed around, so if you have questions for Teresita about what she's been discussing or the art itself, please just raise your hand and I'll call on you and we'll send a mic your way. But just to wrap that conversation while people are forming their thoughts, looking ahead, you have a big project coming up, Olana, and how does that fit into this? Because to me, that kind of encapsulates many of these ideas.
Yeah, so the Cisneros Foundation and the Olana Foundation approached me, and I'm basically doing an installation at Olana at the Frederick Church Estate, which is really loaded, right? Because this is kind of like all our definitions of the American landscape can be pretty much traced to these very Western ideas of the Hudson School painters, and there's a kind of authority that has in shaping the way we think of what's American and what's not. So again, landscape is a kind of interesting subject because most people just don't see it as threatening in any way. So you can
distance on it. And I mean, as Seth wrote today, that we picture landscape far away. It's over there. It's not so specific. I mean, there's that, forest for the trees aspects of it that.
Yeah, but even art historically, it's sort of like nobody knows what it is. Like they kind of think of Frederick Church and then they might think of Smithson. And then that's it. Like it jumps from one to the next and there's nothing in between. So I call it like a sloppy history. It's something that hasn't really been unraveled. So it's a place where I've really been interested in. And so what I did in the Olana project, what I'm doing is I'm making a bunch of works and I'm installing them within the context of all of the images of the first representations of Latin America and the Caribbean by Church and his contemporaries. And I have mined the collections for all of the images of portraits of people that were in these places when the famous paintings that we think of were made. And so it's a way of, the way I'm installing it is the portraits, mostly of indigenous people who were living in those places when these traveler artists were traveling, are confrontational in the sense that they really are kind of returning the gaze of being looked at and being reinserted and reframed into the idea of landscape, right? So it's impossible to think of, say, a church painting or any of the Hudson School painters without thinking of indigenous people on this land, right? It's a complete erasure of like what happened here or what was here. So it's a deeper look. It's a digging into what are we actually looking at? Where are we standing? What was here before this? This has a long history that's important, and that's especially important right now.
Such a project so made for you. That project's just ideal. Just really looking forward. Okay, any questions? Right down here. Mike is coming to you.
As an artist, you've made references to a variety of ethnic identities, but as an individual, how do you want to be perceived?
As an individual.
Yes.
That was a good answer. Excellent. Another question?
You've spoken a bit about the idea of kind of coming too late to the work, and for me, scale is a big part of it, and as a viewer, I feel like I feel the sense of urgency in being so far away from what's being represented. And for me, that's very beautiful, but it's also urgent. And I'm wondering, as an artist on the creative side, is it difficult to permit yourself the space? You say you were thinking about Standing Rock and some of the other issues, but that same distance, I imagine it being difficult to give yourself that feeling like you're just thinking about something as opposed to being more active. Mm-hmm.
That's a
is
great
that a challenge
question.
in making the work?
It's a great question. So as humans, we have this incredible ability to shrink down really small or to become immense, right? And you can take that any way you want. You can take it physically, you can take it perception-wise in terms of being in the landscape or looking at something in a removed way. You can take it, politically, you could take it any way you want, and there's a truth to it, which is that we have an enormous capacity to be elastic. The sort of, you know, like if you think of like a dollhouse or a small thing, and then when you look inside of it, you shrink down, you become the size of the thing that you're looking at. It also implies that you have the ability to become expansive, right? And so I think if you're talking about the landscape in a literal way, scale is important, right? Because again, we are constantly always placing ourselves within place. So we have to negotiate how big or how small we are in relation to something. And closeness and distance has a lot to do with that too, right? So when you're too close to something, you actually can't see it. When you're too far away from something, you also can't see it. If you think of the interrelatedness of looking and seeing and blindness, which is perceived as its opposite, at some point, like being blinded by something and being dazzled by something is optically the same exact thing, right? And so it is within that kind of negotiation of close and far and pulling in and pulling out, pushing in and pulling out, or becoming large and becoming small. It is precisely in the negotiation of that I think real looking happens, or a real understanding of what one is trying to look at. Does that answer your question? It's a hard question.
We have time for one more or two more questions. Down front, Aggie?
I wonder if there are a couple of things that you've done that I've been interested in. The calla lilies that you did for our Millennium show that Kirk Varnado did at MoMA. What was behind them? They were very striking, but I didn't ever know whether they were just something very pretty enlarged or if it had a relationship to...
So the only work that I did at MoMA was an installation on the windows that face the garden, and it was right before the third phase of the construction. So this is old MoMA, historic MoMA, makes you feel old. What I did is I covered all of those windows with a kind of vine pattern that was reflected, but it was green on one side, so the color actually looked like it was outside of the building, reflecting into the depth of the windows. And you know, it was really a way of kind of bringing the outdoors and bringing that garden into the space again, and looking at the threshold of that glass between inside and outside. And a lot of my interests in, you know, landscape are formal. You know, they do have to do with the history of how places have been depicted. So I'm not rejecting those things, or they are part of the conversation, and they're part of the way I see the world, yeah.
And then secondly, did you ever see Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum?
Yeah.
Because what you're doing sounds a little like what he did with the different...
Yeah, no, Fred's show is such a groundbreaking show. I think since that show, we've all been mining museums. And I think that it's almost like there's no other way to describe it other than by using the word mining, which of course is a beautiful way of describing it, because it implies a very assertive act of chipping away at something and actively finding it, right? Rather than just casually stumbling upon it or talking about invisibility. And it's a very empowering kind of way of looking at recontextualizing historical art or art in museums from a contemporary point of view, and from the lens of a contemporary artist, and reshaping the kinds of narratives and reads that we've had, that we've been given and fed so much about what we're looking at and what we're not looking at.
One more. If, when you came to the studio in the school, you were talking to a third grade class, and I wondered if you could just say a little about what you said to that class. I thought it was very profound, in making them realize they could be artists.
The question was regarding Studio in the School, which Aggie is the great, again, Shiro for creating and perpetrating for students in so many classrooms, and for the artists themselves, which I would say it's for us too. We get to do this. So the question was about your experience in those classrooms.
I loved those kids. That was a really incredible experience for me too, and I was trying to keep up with them, if you recall. And I said a lot of things, but I think that the thing that you're referring to was, and this is, probably one of the poorest areas in the Bronx, if not the poorest neighborhood in the Bronx. And these children were they just changed my entire view of everything, because they were so on. And what I told them was I felt an incredible need to tell them that it was very important to protect the things that they found beautiful, and to never let anybody ever convince them that in order to do something important or something that changes the world or something that you can make money at doing or whatever, fill in the blank, that you ever had to give up the thing that you thought was beautiful, in the most basic sense of the word. Because I feel that oftentimes artists, certainly it happens to artists, but it happens to anybody who's just trying to get by, is that they're constantly being asked to give up the things that are beautiful, right? In order to get at the important stuff, the quote unquote important stuff. And so I kind of just told them that, you have this bag of tools, right? And you use this throughout. We all use these things. And one of the most important tools in that bag is beauty. You need that in order to do all the other stuff. So I think that's what you were referring to. And they got it. They totally got it. They were just and the other thing that I told them was language, because most of these kids were bilingual kids. They were a lot of brown and black Hispanic kids, and I remember growing up and people kind of encouraging me to not speak Spanish. I had to fight to make my native language be to own it, and I realized that there was power in it, right? And at some point I realized, why is it that all the poor kids are being told to only speak English and all the rich kids are taking 2 foreign languages, right? So sort of the second language was great if you were rich and bad if you were poor. And so that was the other thing that I told them was in their tool bag, was that language was power. And they had 2 things instead of 1, and that made them special. So yeah.
Well, I think those 2 thoughts are a beautiful way to end this conversation. I hope you'll take some time, be with the art, talk to Teresita in person. I want to thank you so much for sharing so many thoughts. Thank you.